In the 90s, I lived in a rental house in kind of a questionable area. I was recently divorced, and it was the only place I could afford for me and my kids. But still, I really liked the place. So I was disappointed when I got an unexpected letter from the landlord. The place was up for sale, and I only had a month to get out. I had no idea how I was going to find an affordable place that quick. I got obsessed with looking at real estate ads and driving around neighborhoods looking for rent signs. Everything was out of my price range. Then someone at work told me about this program that could help me buy a house. I'd never considered that. I mean, my income was really pathetic back then. But I decided to look into it, and after a ton of paperwork and jumping through a lot of hoops, I got qualified to buy a low-cost house. I started looking at every house I could find in the Louisville area. I can't begin to describe the things I was seeing. These houses were at the very low end of the market. One of them was so trashed and actually had graffiti on the inside. I got discouraged, but one day I happened to drive by a house in the same neighborhood I was living in. It was actually a really cute house. It was an old Victorian. I got an appointment to see it and was surprised how much better it looked than all the others in that price range. I bid on it right away, and before I knew it, I was actually a homeowner. It happened so fast, I didn't really have time to check everything out thoroughly. We were moving in, and the neighbors came outside and we introduced ourselves. They were two guys probably in their early 50s. They were roommates and seemed nice enough. One was Bud and the other was Vern. They weren't very well groomed. Their clothes were old and ratty, and their hair was uncombed and scraggly. Not to judge, but they didn't seem to be taking care of themselves at all. And they seemed to be unemployed. Every now and then they'd get their water shut off for non-payment. They would request that I sling my garden hose over the fence to borrow water. I always said yes. I felt kind of sorry for them and wondered about their situation. As time went on, we found out they had a lot of animals living with them. Every so often, they'd bring one of their animals out to play on their lawn. There was such a variety: hedgehogs, snakes, lizards, different rodents. I mean, a lot of animals. It seemed odd that they were feeding so many pets when they obviously had very little money, but some people really love animals. One night I was putting my kids to bed and happened to look out the window and could see into their kitchen. These old houses were built really close together. I didn't mean to spy, but I noticed their curtains moving in a strange way. I kept looking intently until I was horrified to realize that they were cockroaches. Hundreds of cockroaches were running up and down their curtains and on their walls. I was beyond creeped out. That explained why sometimes I'd find a cockroach or two in my house. They were visitors from next door. That was so unacceptable to me. It was one of the few things I absolutely could not stand. I called a pest control company the next day. When they came out, I told them what I'd seen and said I wanted the perimeter of my house secured. They said it was doubtful that I'd be able to keep them away if there were truly that many cockroaches. I assured them I wasn't exaggerating. They said I'd probably need to talk to the neighbors and get them to participate in some pest control also. It was agonizing for me, but that evening, I forced myself to go next door and knock on their front door. No one answered. The front of the house looked dark, but I saw lights toward the back. Their house bordered the alley, so I walked down it to their back gate to check the backyard. I reached to knock on the gate, but when I touched it, it opened. I didn't see Bud or Vern. There was a low wattage light on their porch, and it was lighting up this huge animal cage, about 5 feet tall. I was curious about it as I hadn't seen them bring out any animals very large before. Something big and hairless was in there. It was crouched with its back to me. When it heard the gate creak, it turned around and I immediately screamed. There's no way to describe this, but the best way to put it was that its face was a mix between a man and a dinosaur. Its yellow eyes looked right at me, and it grabbed the bars of the cage with these big black claws. It looked at me hatefully and started to stand up. I swear it was at least as tall as the cage. I was terrified and slammed the gate and ran home. I was shaking like crazy. I couldn't believe it. Were those smaller animals food for that horrible thing? I ended up looking up the property records for that house and found out Bud and Vern were renting it from an absentee owner. I reported the condition of the house to her and told her there was an extremely large and unusual thing living in the backyard. By the next month, they had been evicted and there was no sign left of anyone. The house was gutted and remodeled. No one would ever know what it had been like before. I recently visited my childhood home to help my siblings clean it out, as our mother finally passed and was struck with a sudden memory. We grew up in a rural area with a large field behind our house. It has since been purchased by developers, but back when I was 10 or so, it was used to grow alfalfa. Our parents always told us to be careful out in the field as there were occasionally hunters or loose dogs running around. We used to play out there a lot anyway, and one of the most thrilling and terrifying things as a kid was finding deer hunting stands in the woods around the edge of the field. I'm assuming the farmer must have owned the surrounding woodlands and leased the property out for hunting. My siblings, 2 brothers, both older, and I didn't go into the woods often. I think part of it was we were scared, especially with hunters around. Our family wasn't familiar with guns, so we had an aversion to them. The woods were also just always very dark, even during the day. They grew thick and the trees blocked out a lot of the light. One day, for whatever reason, when I was about 10, my brothers and I decided to go on an adventure in the woods. Some teenagers up the street had been driving ATVs on the property illegally, and their misadventures left great walking trails. These trails were wide and cleared of big logs or rocks, so they were an attractive adventure for kids our age. This was during the summer, and it was probably around noon or so when we decided to just take off on one of the trails. If you stood at the top of our property facing the field, we went into the woods on the far left side. We'd found abandoned hunting blinds there before, but the trail was far away from them, so we felt comfortable. What we didn't expect was to find any kind of dwelling in the woods. Like I said, the trees were thick, and I never imagined a house would be in there. But about a 10-minute walk in, we found a little house. This had to be a good mile back from the road our house was on. The house was in bad condition, with the roof mostly caved in and the siding obviously rotting. We all stopped on a little rise of boulders and quietly tried to figure out what to do. Should we go down and check it out, or head home? Our mom wouldn't have been happy knowing we explored a house literally falling in on itself, but it was just too tempting. We made our way down the trail, which was now just a game trail, like what deer and rabbits walk, and came up close to the house. It still looked rough, but surprisingly solid. My brothers and I were trying to figure out how it got here and who had lived here. There was an area nearby full of saplings, no wider than an inch or two, so we assumed that had been a sort of driveway to reach the house at some point. We started looking around, and my middle brother went into the house despite our warnings. The front door was hanging off, so my other brother and I just peeked through to see what it was like inside. The floor was also caved in, but there was no basement. A few shattered plates and cups with old paisley designs were laying around. The creepy part was there were still some items in the house for day-to-day living. The brother inside the house walked to what looked like a closet and opened it up. There was a toilet and a very small sink inside, both obviously unused for a long time. There was one other door that, judging from the layout of the house, must have been another room. He opened it and then stepped back immediately. He called us over, but we were both even more reluctant to go in now. After a few minutes of him telling us there was just another door, we walked carefully into the room and to where he was. What we were looking at was definitely not just another door. In the floor of the room was a giant metal hatch, like what you'd see on a ship or submarine. It even had a wheel handle and several bolts bigger than an adult's fist. Surprisingly, this thing was in pretty good shape. Most of the roof over this room was intact. The metal was a worn gray-green color and pitted. It wasn't rusted, but didn't look like it had been opened in a very, very long time. My middle brother kept messing around and trying to turn the wheel, But my other brother and I were so freaked out that we ended up pulling him out of the house and running back up the trail. We went home and only talked about it a few times over the next day or two. It never came up again, and I'd totally forgotten about it until we went to clear out our childhood home. I asked my older brother, the middle brother now lives in Florida, if he remembered. His face briefly went pale, and he confirmed that he did. I have no idea what happened to the house or the hatch in the floor. There's now a big development of condos there. But to this day, I don't think it was a bunker or anything. It was way too sophisticated for the little house, and I'm mostly convinced that it was where the government decided to hide an underground facility for something. Guess we'll never know now. I don't even blame anyone if they don't believe this story. I wouldn't believe it either if it hadn't happened to me. My ex-girlfriend was there too, and she still doesn't believe it. During the pandemic, I met a nice girl from Oregon named Presley online, and we really hit it off. After a year of talking and Skype calling, we decided it was finally time to meet in person. Instead of just getting together for a weekend at one or the other of our places like normal people would do, we decided to take a cross-country road trip together before classes started back in the fall. What could go wrong? Apparently, everything. While I could write a novel on all the horrors we encountered before reaching New York, including bad Airbnb experiences, a flat tire, and multiple arguments, our night in New York was the biggie. My mother always told me to never talk bad about a woman, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Presley's personality in person was much different than the girl I thought I had come to know online. Nothing impressed her, but I tried my hardest to show her a good time anyway. By the time we got to New York, things between us were looking pretty rocky. She had already called home crying and talked to her mother at least 3 times, and had even gone as far as to say she might catch a plane in Maine and not make the return drive with me. Despite our struggles, I really didn't want to wind up broken up before our relationship had a chance to gain footing in the real world. I did a quick Google search from the bathroom at a gas station and found information on the Falling Waters Preserve in rural New York. The photos made it look crazy romantic, and I thought if anything was going to save us, it'd be that place. It was a little more difficult to find than I expected, though, and she got pretty annoyed with me getting us lost out in the middle of nowhere without telling her where we were going. By the time we got there, it was dark, and you couldn't even really see the falls. We were just out in the dark woods for nothing. She headed off down the trail ahead of me, slapping mosquitoes the whole way. I started following behind her, but then got distracted by a strange clicking sound. It's hard to describe exactly what it sounded like. It was almost like the sound you hear when you pull zip ties tight, but it just kept going. Then there was the sound of rustling in the branches all around me. Presley? There was no nose. It was completely hairless. No eyebrows. No leg hair. Nothing. And its eyes were solid black. No whites to be seen. I was frozen in fear. So scared, in fact, that I wet my pants as I stood there staring at it. When I finally did get my faculties about me, I started backing away slow, trembling in my boots. It opened up its mouth wide, revealing razor-sharp dog-like teeth and a long tongue that unrolled from the mouth as it screeched. Then it took off running away from me through the woods in a flash. I turned and ran straight back to the car myself and found Presley sitting in the front seat waiting impatiently. I started the car, frantically telling her about everything that had just happened. She barely looked up from her phone at first. When I finished the story, though, she turned to give me a disbelieving look and asked, "Why would you make something like that up?" I started to say, "Exactly, why would I?" But that's when she noticed I'd wet myself. Needless to say, Presley caught a plane home the next morning and hasn't spoken to me since. She thinks I made the whole thing up to justify having an accident in my pants, which has been the cherry on top of a would-be fun trip that went sour for a number of reasons. I know what I saw, though. After doing some research online, I learned all about the rake, and I'm convinced that's what visited me in those rural New York woods that night. He was the second ugliest personality I encountered on the trip. I'm from upstate Maine, just south of New Brunswick, Canada. My home is almost on the border, so I'm about as far north as you can get. I spent a few years out of high school working on an oil rig, and once I had money saved up, I built a small cabin up here on almost 20 acres of land. It's the perfect, peaceful place I've always wanted, but definitely comes with some strange events. Most of these events can be attributed to day-to-day things, like neighbors who don't understand boundary lines. It's not usually an issue as I own a few firearms and can be pretty intimidating when I want to. Having 2 cane corsos helps too. I have a few chickens, and the dogs keep coyotes and foxes off the property. This past spring, I had a UFO experience that I thought you might find interesting. I say UFO because it's the only option I've been able to come up with for what I witnessed. I'll just get straight to it. I always take my dogs out before going to bed. They're 2 big neutered males, so I have a 6-foot industrial fence that encloses about 700 feet of the yard, so I don't have to worry about them getting out. I like to go out and stand on the porch with them just to keep an eye on things, and that's what I was doing at this time. It was pretty late and already dark, but I have floodlights out back, so the whole area was lit up out to the tree line. My significant other was on their way over, and I was keeping an ear out. I live on a dirt road, and it's easy to hear cars coming up my way. I was just enjoying the night and watching the dogs romp around when I saw something out of place over the trees. Like I said, this is pretty far north, so seeing lights isn't uncommon. A few times a year you can actually see the northern lights from Maine, and it's pretty cool. But even as I was squinting to try and make out what I was looking at, I realized it wasn't really the season to see aurora borealis. The dogs were completely ignorant of what was going on overhead and just sniffing around in the grass. I stared up at what looked like a foggy area spreading low on the horizon, just behind the treetops. It was hard to tell how large or small it was because I couldn't really place how far away it was. At first, it did look a little like the northern lights. But whenever I've seen them, they've been a light blue or green. This was a kind of soupy gray color. I kept staring for a minute, trying to remember if there was an airport or something out that way. Definitely nothing like city lights that would flood the night sky. I was about to write it off as just as weird night and call the dogs in when 5 lights in a perfect row suddenly blinked into existence. They were lined up perfectly horizontally. That seemed odd. I had heard of satellites or launched known objects showing up in the sky with this kind of lighting, but usually local chatter gives me a heads up about this stuff. I pulled out my phone and called my significant other. They answered and quickly said they were a few minutes away. "Are you at a place you can pull off?" I asked. I could tell by the tone of their voice that they thought it was a strange question, but they agreed to pull off to the side of the road and asked why. When they had pulled over, I explained that I was seeing something weird in the sky and wanted to know if they could see it where they were too. I heard them open the car door on the other end, a few seconds of silence, and then they confirmed that yeah, they could see it. We mused about what it might be for a moment when the light suddenly shifted. This is what made me absolutely sure it wasn't a satellite or some kind of mechanical object. It moved slowly over the trees, probably a few miles out, and at the same time I heard my significant other's car pull into the driveway. They came around the side of the house, through the gate, quickly greeted the dogs and got up next to me. I pointed out the largest light. The others were all gone now. That was almost acting as if it were scoping out the area. "Is that near anything?" my significant other asked, but neither of us could identify why it would be there. We watched it move for a few minutes until it started receding again, and then, like the others, just sort of dissipated. Both of us had trouble sleeping that night. I didn't necessarily get a malevolent feeling from it, but just knowing that UFOs are really out there makes me a little uncomfortable. It feels better to have a roof over my head. I don't always go out with the dogs these days, and while I appreciate the peace and quiet out here, it really makes you think about just how alone we are. Last year I was working in a warehouse that my dad bought in Pennsylvania. It was in a remote location with no neighbors within a half-mile, and all you could see around there were cornfields. My dad got it for about half of what it was worth. The guy who was getting rid of it seemed really stoked when my dad signed the papers, which probably should have been a warning. The warehouse was huge, but the remote location had its drawbacks. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of cell service in the area, which made it hard to coordinate with suppliers or customers. Anyway, we made it work with a landline. I usually worked alone. My main job was to restore the front office area so it could be more efficient and functional. In order to reach the front office, you had to pass through a hallway connecting the main warehouse to another office space, and then proceed through yet another door to get to the front. From the first day I started working there, EL was always hearing these weird thumps and banging noises. But the thing that always made me feel especially weird was that the door locks were backwards. It was like they were designed to keep something confined inside the building rather than keeping people out. I was in the front office one day when I started to hear the loudest thumping I had heard so far. At first, I tried to ignore it and kept putting painter's tape around the door in front of me, but when I heard a screeching sound on top of the thumping, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart started racing, and I was wishing that I could just have one day of freaking peace to do my work in. I couldn't imagine what it could be. I assumed it had to be an animal of some sort that had found its way inside. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing to worry about. But my nervousness only got worse when I heard the violent slam of the secondary office door. I peeked around the corner and saw that the door was closed. Even though I knew there was no draft strong enough to make the door close so violently, I tried to pretend that's what happened. But I knew something strange was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling of creepiness that had settled in my gut, and I knew I needed to investigate to figure out what was going on. The thumping noise got closer, and my heart was really pounding. I couldn't tell how close the noise was, but it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. I couldn't move. My eyes were focused on the door handle, and I watched it slowly start to turn. The door opened, and I could feel myself just wanting to run. The door swung wider and wider until it was fully open, but there was nothing there. No visible movement, no air movement, just creepy silence. The silence was that deafening kind that you can actually hear. It was like the quiet had a presence of its own, and it was suffocating me. Then there was this ungodly screech. It totally sounded human, and it sounded like it was coming from the main warehouse. The pain and anger in that scream was just chilling. Without thinking, I turned and ran out of the front office. I needed to get as far away as possible from whatever was happening in the warehouse. I got in my car and drove until I had cell service to call my dad. Even though he sounded skeptical about all the door-closing weirdness, he did acknowledge that something strange was going on with the building. He said he would come and check it out, and we agreed to meet up at the site. About half an hour later, my dad and I arrived at the warehouse. I showed him the door that had slammed shut earlier, pointing out how it was separate from both the front office and the main warehouse. It was clear that no draft could have made it close. I reminded him that there was no logical reason for all the thumping noises and the screeching noises that had been going on. He agreed to investigate the main warehouse with me. With my dad by my side, I felt brave enough to lead the way into the warehouse. The building used to be a furniture manufacturing facility, and they made handcrafted tables, chairs, and other furniture items, which meant that the floor had a thick coat of dust on it. We stepped inside the warehouse, and nothing seemed out of place. The dust on the floor wasn't disturbed, the doors were closed, and the windows were all locked. The only thing that caught our attention was one of the fluorescent light fixtures was hanging down and swaying a little. My dad got a ladder and held it steady while I climbed up to inspect the light. As I looked on top of the light, I saw something that just gave me chills. It was a large, fresh, human handprint. There were no footprints in the dust around the light, nothing at all. I climbed down and switched places with my dad. He saw it and said, "That's not possible. There's been no one in here for months." And then, Like it wanted to make its presence known, the thumping noise returned. But this time it was different. It felt like an earthquake shaking the whole building. That was followed up by that horrible screech. It felt like it was coming right out of the walls. We ran out of there, and I have not returned to that building since. My dad had to hire someone else to finish my work. The new employee reported hearing the thumping noise, but so far, no other strange events have occurred. I might never know what actually happened there, but there's no doubt in my mind that there's a paranormal presence in that building, and the previous owner was fully aware of it. The memory of the sound of that lock turning on its own, and the feeling of being surrounded by that oppressive presence will stay with me forever.